Hello, and welcome to Starlit Science. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy calm explorations of the universe and the mysteries of science. It really helps the channel grow, and I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching or listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments. Whether you're in a busy city, a quiet countryside, or somewhere under a sky full of stars, it's fascinating to think that every one of us, wherever we are, is using the same remarkable organ to understand the universe, the human brain. Now pause for a moment and consider something quietly astonishing. The universe began nearly 13.8 billion years ago in a hot and dense state we call the Big Bang. Over immense stretches of time, matter cooled, stars formed, galaxies assembled, and the elements that make up planets and life itself were forged inside stellar furnaces. Eventually, on at least one small planet orbiting an ordinary star, something extraordinary happened. Matter organized itself into living systems. Those living systems developed nervous systems, and those nervous systems eventually became capable of something even more remarkable: awareness. Right now, as you listen to this, roughly 86 billion neurons inside your brain are exchanging electrical signals. Tiny pulses of electricity flow along microscopic fibers. Chemical messengers leap across synapses. Vast networks of cells interact in intricate patterns. From this activity emerges thought, memory, imagination, curiosity, and perhaps most mysteriously of all, conscious experience. For more than a century, neuroscience has explained these processes using the familiar rules of classical physics and chemistry. Neurons fire, signals propagate, networks compute. But some scientists have wondered whether something deeper might be happening. At the smallest scales of nature, the universe behaves in ways that are profoundly strange. Particles can exist in multiple states at once. Objects separated by vast distances can become mysteriously linked. Reality itself seems to behave more like a field of probabilities than a collection of solid objects. This strange domain is known as quantum mechanics, and it governs the behavior of the smallest building blocks of the universe. Which leads to a quietly radical question. Could the brain, one of the most complex structures known, be tapping into these quantum processes? Could consciousness itself, the feeling of being aware, somehow emerge from phenomena that operate at the deepest levels of physical reality? Or is the brain simply an incredibly sophisticated classical machine, no more quantum than a toaster or a smartphone? Tonight we're going to explore this fascinating scientific frontier. We'll journey from the familiar territory of neuroscience into the strange landscapes of quantum physics. Along the way, we'll encounter bold theories, skeptical critiques, and some of the most intriguing ideas proposed by physicists, neuroscientists, and philosophers. Some of these ideas are controversial, some are speculative, and some may eventually prove to be wrong. But together, they represent humanity's ongoing attempt to understand one of the greatest mysteries in existence, how the universe became aware of itself. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our exploration of a remarkable question. Could the brain operate on quantum principles? Right now, as you listen to this, something quietly extraordinary is happening inside your head. About 86 billion neurons are exchanging signals. Electrical impulses travel along delicate biological wires called axons. Chemical messengers cross microscopic gaps known as synapses. Patterns of activity ripple across vast neural networks, forming the thoughts, images, memories, and questions that make up your inner experience. Among those thoughts may be curiosity about the universe itself. And that leads to a rather remarkable observation. The universe, after billions of years of evolution, has produced a structure capable of observing and reflecting on its own existence. In other words, the cosmos has given rise to something that can look back at the stars and ask where they came from. The human brain is that structure. It weighs a little over 3 pounds. It consumes roughly 20% of the energy used by the entire body, while accounting for only a small fraction of its mass. It is made from ordinary atoms, the same elements found in rocks, oceans, and distant galaxies. And yet from this assembly of atoms emerges awareness. To appreciate just how remarkable that is, it helps to step back and look at the long story that led here. The universe began approximately 13.8 billion years ago in an event we call the Big Bang. In those earliest moments, the universe was unimaginably hot and dense. Space itself was expanding rapidly, and the fundamental particles that would eventually form matter were just beginning to appear. In the first few minutes after the Big Bang, simple atomic nuclei formed. Hydrogen and helium became the most abundant elements in the young universe. But the universe was still dark. There were no stars yet, no galaxies, and certainly no planets. Hundreds of millions of years passed before gravity began pulling vast clouds of gas together. These clouds collapsed under their own weight, igniting the first generation of stars. Inside those stars, nuclear fusion began forging heavier elements. Hydrogen fused into helium, helium fused into carbon and oxygen. In the hearts of massive stars, even heavier elements such as iron were eventually created. When some of those stars reached the end of their lives, they exploded as supernovae. Those explosions scattered newly forged elements across interstellar space: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, the raw ingredients for life. Over billions of years, galaxies continued forming stars. Planetary systems emerged around many of those stars. On at least one small planet orbiting a fairly ordinary star in the outer regions of the Milky Way galaxy, chemistry began to do something interesting. Atoms combined into molecules. Molecules formed increasingly complex structures. Some of those structures developed the ability to replicate themselves. Life had begun. The earliest living organisms were extremely simple, single-celled microbes drifting in ancient oceans. For a very long time, life on Earth remained microscopic, but evolution is patient. Across immense stretches of time, natural selection slowly produced more complex organisms. Cells learned to cooperate, forming multicellular creatures. Nervous systems began to appear. These networks of nerve cells allowed organisms to sense their surroundings and respond more effectively to the environment. Eventually, some of these nervous systems grew larger and more intricate. Fish developed centralized brains. Reptiles evolved more advanced neural circuits. Mammals added layers of brain structures associated with learning, emotion, and memory. And finally, within the last few 100,000 years, a species appeared whose brains possessed an unusual ability: the ability to reflect. Human beings not only experience the world, we can also think about thinking. We can ask questions about reality itself. Why does the universe exist? What are the laws that govern nature? And perhaps most intriguingly, what exactly is happening inside our own minds? Physicists and neuroscientists have been exploring those questions for decades, and occasionally the answers lead into unexpected territory. One physicist who thought deeply about this connection between observation and reality was John Archibald Wheeler. Wheeler was a prominent American theoretical physicist who worked on nuclear physics, general relativity, and quantum mechanics throughout the 20th century. He studied under Niels Bohr, collaborated with Albert Einstein, and helped introduce the term black hole into the scientific vocabulary. But Wheeler was also fascinated by a more philosophical question: what role do observers play in the universe? In the strange world of quantum mechanics, observation seems to matter in surprising ways. Certain experiments suggest that the act of measurement can influence how quantum systems behave. Particles that exist in a spread of possible states appear to settle into definite outcomes when they are observed. Wheeler proposed a provocative idea known as the participatory universe. In this view, observers are not merely passive spectators watching reality unfold from the sidelines. Instead, observation may play a role in bringing aspects of physical reality into definite form. Wheeler once suggested that the universe might be participatory in nature. In other words, the universe and its observers could be part of a single, interconnected process. To illustrate this concept, Wheeler coined a famous phrase: "it from bit." This phrase compresses a surprisingly deep idea into 3 simple words. The word it refers to physical things: particles, fields, matter, energy. The word bit refers to information, a binary choice, yes or no, 0 or 1. Wheeler proposed that physical reality might ultimately arise from information. In this perspective, the fundamental layer of the universe is not matter itself, but the informational structure that defines how matter behaves. In other words, the physical world may be built from the answers to countless microscopic questions. Quantum physics already hints at something like this. At very small scales, particles behave less like tiny billiard balls and more like probability distributions. Instead of having definite properties at all times, quantum systems are described by mathematical objects known as wave functions. These wave functions represent sets of possible outcomes. When a measurement occurs, one of those possibilities becomes real. Exactly how and why this happens remains one of the deepest puzzles in modern physics, and this puzzle raises a fascinating possibility. If information and observation play such fundamental roles in quantum mechanics, what happens when a system capable of observation appears inside the universe itself? After billions of years of cosmic evolution, the universe produced biological organisms capable of measuring, recording, and interpreting information. Eventually, those organisms developed brains, and those brains developed minds. Which brings us back to the question, quietly, waiting beneath all of this. What exactly is the brain doing when it generates awareness? Most neuroscientists describe brain activity using the familiar rules of classical physics and chemistry. Electrical signals move through neurons. Neurotransmitters carry messages across synapses. Networks of cells process information in ways that can often be compared to computation. This classical picture explains a tremendous amount about how the brain works. But some researchers have wondered whether it tells the entire story. The brain is not only complex, it is also built from molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles. At those scales, the laws governing nature are not classical, they're quantum. So an intriguing question emerges. Could some aspects of brain function depend on quantum processes taking place deep within its microscopic structures? Could the phenomenon we call consciousness involve mechanisms connected to the strange principles of quantum physics? Or is the brain simply an astonishingly sophisticated classical machine, operating entirely through biological chemistry and electrical signals? To explore those possibilities, we need to take a closer look at the strange and fascinating world of quantum mechanics itself. To understand whether the brain might ever involve quantum processes, it helps to begin with the model that neuroscientists already use with remarkable success. For more than a century, the dominant explanation of brain function has been built on a relatively straightforward idea. The brain operates through networks of specialized cells that communicate using electricity and chemistry. These cells are called neurons, and their interactions form the foundation of nearly everything the brain does. This framework is known as the classical model of neuroscience. In this model, thoughts, memories, perceptions, and decisions all arise from patterns of activity spreading through networks of neurons. The signals themselves are physical events, measurable and observable. Electrical impulses move along biological structures, chemical molecules cross microscopic gaps between cells, and vast interconnected circuits process information continuously. It is an elegant system, and despite the brain's immense complexity, scientists have learned a great deal about how it works. Much of that understanding can be traced back to the painstaking work of a Spanish neuroscientist named Santiago Ramón y Cajal. In the late 19th century, scientists were still debating the structure of the nervous system. Some researchers believed the brain was a continuous web of tissue, sometimes called the reticular theory. According to this idea, nerve cells merge together into one large network without clear boundaries between individual cells. Cajal suspected something different. Using improved staining techniques originally developed by Italian scientist Camillo Golgi, Cajal began examining thin slices of brain tissue under a microscope. The Golgi staining method allowed individual neurons to become visible against the surrounding tissue, revealing their branching structures in extraordinary detail. What Cajal saw changed neuroscience forever. Instead of a continuous web, the brain appeared to be made from countless individual cells. Each neuron was a separate entity with its own structure. These cells extended long branching projections that reached toward other neurons, but they did not physically merge into one continuous structure. From these observations, Cajal proposed what became known as the neuron doctrine. The neuron doctrine states that the nervous system is composed of discrete individual cells called neurons. These neurons communicate with one another at specialized contact points, rather than forming a single continuous network. Later research confirmed that these contact points are called synapses. At a synapse, two neurons come extremely close together, but they do not actually touch. A microscopic gap remains between them. This tiny space, known as the synaptic cleft, is only about 20 to 40 nanometers wide. To give a sense of scale, a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. If a human hair were expanded to the width of a large river, the synaptic cleft would still be smaller than a pebble on the riverbank. Despite this minuscule distance, Signals cross the gap reliably billions of times every second throughout the brain. The process begins with an electrical impulse known as an action potential. An action potential is a brief change in electrical voltage that travels along a neuron's long projection called an axon. The signal moves because charged ions, mainly sodium and potassium, flow across the cell membrane through specialized protein channels. When the voltage across the membrane reaches a certain threshold, these ion channels open in rapid succession. The electrical change travels down the axon like a carefully coordinated wave. When the signal reaches the end of the axon, something interesting happens. The electrical impulse triggers the release of chemical messengers known as neurotransmitters. These molecules are stored inside tiny sacs called vesicles located at the end of the neuron. The vesicles fuse with the cell membrane and release neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. The molecules drift across the gap and bind to receptors on the neighboring neuron. When the receptors are activated, they influence the electrical state of the receiving neuron. If enough signals arrive, that neuron may generate its own action potential, passing the message onward through the network. This electrochemical process repeats itself constantly. It is the fundamental communication system of the brain. Different neurotransmitters carry different kinds of signals. Dopamine is often associated with reward and motivation. Serotonin influences mood and emotional regulation. Glutamate functions as one of the primary excitatory neurotransmitters, while gamma-aminobutyric acid, often abbreviated as GABA, acts as a major inhibitory signal. Together, these chemical systems create a dynamic balance between excitation and inhibition within neural circuits. The sheer scale of this activity is staggering. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons. Each neuron may form connections with thousands of other neurons. When all of these connections are counted, the total number of synapses in the human brain is estimated to be somewhere between 100 trillion and several hundred trillion. That means the brain contains more connections than there are stars in our galaxy. Every moment, electrical signals are traveling across this vast biological network. Patterns of neural activity shift constantly as the brain processes sensory information, stores memories, plans actions, and generates thoughts. Despite the immense complexity, the underlying mechanisms remain grounded in classical physics and chemistry. Electrical currents flow through ion channels. Chemical molecules diffuse across synapses. Proteins change shape when they bind to neurotransmitters. These are all processes governed by well-understood physical laws. Scientists can observe many of these events directly using modern technology. Electroencephalography, often called EEG, measures electrical activity across the scalp by detecting tiny voltage changes produced by groups of neurons. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, commonly abbreviated as fMRI, detects changes in blood flow associated with neural activity. Electrophysiology experiments record the electrical signals of individual neurons with microscopic electrodes. Through these methods, neuroscientists can watch brain activity unfold in real time. Over the past few decades, researchers have also begun mapping the large-scale wiring diagram of the brain. One major effort in this direction is the Human Connectome Project. The Human Connectome Project is a large international research initiative designed to map the structural and functional connections within the human brain. It was coordinated in part by neuroscientist David Van Essen at Washington University in St. Louis. Using advanced imaging techniques, the project has produced detailed maps of neural pathways linking different regions of the brain. These maps help scientists understand how information flows between areas responsible for vision, language, memory, and decision-making. The emerging picture is one of extraordinary complexity. The brain contains specialized regions dedicated to different tasks, yet these regions rarely work in isolation. Instead, they operate as part of large distributed networks. Signals move continuously between cortical areas, subcortical structures, and deeper brain regions such as the thalamus and brainstem. From these interactions emerge the patterns of activity associated with perception, emotion, reasoning, and imagination. Importantly, nearly all of these processes can be explained using classical mechanisms. The signals involved are electrical and chemical. The interactions follow well-established physical laws. No exotic physics is required to explain how neurons transmit signals or how networks of neurons produce behavior. For this reason, the vast majority of neuroscientists believe that the brain operates as a biological information processing system grounded in classical physics. This does not make the brain simple, far from it. Even with classical mechanisms alone, the brain remains one of the most complex structures known in the universe. Understanding how billions of neurons cooperate to produce consciousness, memory, and thought remains an enormous scientific challenge. But at least at the level of neurons and synapses, the basic rules appear clear. Electricity flows, chemistry carries messages, networks compute. And yet, if we continue looking deeper into the microscopic structure of neurons themselves, we eventually reach the realm where classical physics begins to give way to a stranger set of rules. The rules of the quantum world. To understand why some scientists have wondered about quantum effects in the brain, we need to step into a very different layer of reality. At everyday scales, the world behaves in ways that feel intuitive. Objects have definite positions. A thrown ball follows a predictable path. A light switch turns on or off in a straightforward and reliable way. The physical laws that describe these familiar behaviors belong to what physicists call classical physics. These laws were developed through the work of scientists such as Isaac Newton, James Clerk Maxwell, and Albert Einstein. Classical physics describes gravity, motion, electricity, and many other phenomena with remarkable accuracy. For planets, engines, and even the electrical signals inside neurons, classical physics works extremely well. But when scientists began examining nature at extremely small scales during the early 20th century, they discovered that the rules change in surprising ways. Atoms and subatomic particles do not always behave like tiny solid objects. Instead, their behavior follows a different set of principles known as quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is the branch of physics that describes how matter and energy behave at the scale of atoms, electrons, and photons. The story of quantum mechanics began in the year 1900 with a German physicist named Max Planck. Planck was studying how heated objects emit light, a phenomenon known as black-body radiation. According to classical physics, the amount of energy emitted at certain wavelengths should have increased endlessly, leading to a prediction that became known as the ultraviolet catastrophe. Experiments clearly showed that this prediction was wrong. Planck proposed a radical solution. He suggested that energy is not emitted in a continuous flow. Instead, energy is released in tiny discrete packets, which he called quanta. This idea introduced a fundamental concept of quantum physics. Energy comes in discrete units. Planck himself initially viewed this idea as a mathematical trick rather than a deep truth about nature, but in the years that followed, experiments continued to support the notion that energy behaves in quantized steps rather than smooth continuous amounts. In 1905, Albert Einstein used Planck's idea to explain the photoelectric effect. In the photoelectric effect, light shining on a metal surface can eject electrons from that surface. Classical wave theories of light could not explain why this occurred only above certain frequencies. Einstein proposed that light itself behaves as if it were made of tiny particles of energy, later called photons. This discovery introduced a strange new duality. Light behaves both as a wave and as a particle, depending on how it is observed. This phenomenon became known as wave-particle duality. Later experiments showed that matter itself behaves the same way. Electrons, which were once imagined as tiny orbiting particles inside atoms, also display wave-like properties. In experiments such as the famous double-slit experiment, electrons can produce interference patterns characteristic of waves. In this experiment, a beam of electrons is directed toward a barrier containing two narrow openings. Behind the barrier sits a detection screen that records where electrons land. If electrons behaved strictly like tiny particles, one might expect two clusters to form on the screen, corresponding to the two slits. Instead, something very different appears. The pattern on the screen forms a series of alternating bands, an interference pattern identical to what is produced when waves overlap. Even more remarkably, the pattern still appears when electrons are sent through the apparatus one at a time. Each individual electron seems to behave as if it travels through both slits simultaneously and interferes with itself. This puzzling behavior is explained through the concept of superposition. Superposition means that a quantum system can exist in multiple possible states at the same time until a measurement is made. Instead of having one definite position or path, a particle is described by a wave function. The wave function represents a range of possible outcomes, each associated with a probability. When a measurement occurs, the system appears to settle into one specific outcome. exactly how and why this transition happens remains one of the central mysteries of quantum mechanics. Another foundational concept is uncertainty. In 1927, the German physicist Werner Heisenberg introduced what is now known as the uncertainty principle. The uncertainty principle states that certain pairs of physical properties cannot both be measured with perfect precision at the same time. The most famous example involves position and momentum. Momentum refers to the quantity of motion possessed by an object. It is defined as mass multiplied by velocity. The relationship described by Heisenberg can be expressed verbally as follows. The uncertainty in position multiplied by the uncertainty in momentum must always be greater than or equal to Planck's constant divided by 4 times the mathematical constant Ps. This relationship does not arise from limitations of measurement technology. Instead, it reflects a fundamental property of nature. At quantum scales, particles do not possess exact position and momentum simultaneously. Instead, their behavior is inherently probabilistic. Another key contributor to the development of quantum mechanics was the Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger. In 1926, Schrödinger introduced an equation that describes how the wave function of a quantum system evolves over time. This equation became one of the central mathematical foundations of quantum theory. The Schrödinger equation allows physicists to calculate how probability waves associated with particles move and interact. Schrödinger later illustrated the strange implications of quantum mechanics through a famous thought experiment known as Schrödinger's cat. In this imagined scenario, a cat is placed inside a sealed box containing a radioactive atom, a detector, and a small vial of poison. If the atom decays, the detector triggers the release of poison, and the cat dies. If the atom does not decay, the cat remains alive. According to a straightforward interpretation of quantum mechanics, the atom exists in a superposition of decayed and not decayed until it is measured. If the cat's fate depends on the atom, then before the box is opened, the system could theoretically exist in a superposition where the cat is both alive and dead. Schrödinger proposed this scenario partly to illustrate how strange quantum ideas can seem when applied to large objects. In practice, systems at everyday scales rarely display such superpositions because interactions with the environment rapidly destroy delicate quantum states. Nevertheless, quantum mechanics has proven extraordinarily successful in describing nature. It explains the structure of atoms, the behavior of semiconductors, the operation of lasers, and the stability of molecules. Without quantum mechanics, modern electronics, computers, and many medical technologies would not exist. In short, quantum physics radically reshaped our understanding of matter and energy. At the smallest scales, the universe behaves less like a collection of solid objects, and more like a web of probabilities and interactions. For many decades, physicists assumed that these strange quantum effects were confined mostly to the microscopic world. Atoms behave quantum mechanically. Electrons behave quantum mechanically. But large systems made from many particles were expected to behave according to classical physics, because quantum effects tend to fade away as systems interact with their environment. However, during the past few decades, researchers have begun to discover that some biological systems may actually make use of quantum phenomena. Certain processes inside living organisms appear to involve quantum coherence, tunneling, or other effects normally associated with atomic scale physics. These discoveries have given rise to a new and growing field of research known as quantum biology. And once scientists began recognizing quantum behavior in biological systems, an intriguing possibility naturally followed. If quantum effects can influence some biological processes, could they also play a role in the most complex biological system we know, the human brain? For many years, scientists assumed that quantum mechanics belonged almost entirely to the world of atoms and laboratory experiments. The strange behaviors of superposition, coherence, and tunneling were expected to vanish quickly in the messy, warm environments of living organisms. After all, biological systems are busy places. Molecules collide constantly. Thermal motion jostles everything. Cells are full of chemical reactions occurring in rapid succession. Under such noisy conditions, delicate quantum states were thought to disappear almost instantly through a process known as decoherence. Yet over the past few decades, a growing number of experiments have revealed something surprising. In certain cases, life appears to make use of quantum phenomena. This emerging field of study is known as quantum biology. It sits at the intersection of physics, chemistry, and biology, and it explores whether living systems might exploit quantum effects to perform certain tasks more efficiently. The field does not claim that organisms operate like quantum computers in any simple sense. Instead, researchers investigate whether specific biological processes might involve quantum coherence, tunneling, or other subtle quantum behaviors. One of the most influential discoveries in this area came from studies of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process by which plants, algae, and certain bacteria convert sunlight into chemical energy. The process begins when light is absorbed by specialized pigment molecules within structures known as light harvesting complexes. These complexes capture photons and transfer the absorbed energy to a reaction center, where the energy is used to drive chemical reactions that ultimately produce sugars. The efficiency of this energy transfer has fascinated scientists for decades. In many photosynthetic systems, more than 95% of the absorbed energy successfully reaches the reaction center. That level of efficiency is extraordinary. For comparison, many human-engineered solar panels convert less than 25% of incoming sunlight into electrical energy. Understanding how biological systems achieve such remarkable performance became an intriguing question for physicists. In the early 2000 years, a research group led by chemist Graham Fleming at the University of California, Berkeley, began studying the energy transfer process in photosynthetic bacteria. Fleming and his colleagues used a sophisticated technique known as two-dimensional electronic spectroscopy. This experimental method uses extremely short laser pulses to probe how energy moves between molecules on timescales measured in femtoseconds. A femtosecond is 1/400,000th of a second. To visualize that timescale, consider this comparison. 1 femtosecond compared to 1 second is roughly the same ratio as 1 second compared to about 32 million years. Using these ultrafast measurements, Fleming's team observed oscillations in the energy transfer signals that suggested something remarkable. The energy seemed to move through the molecular network in a way consistent with quantum coherence. Quantum coherence refers to a situation in which multiple possible energy pathways exist simultaneously and interact with one another through wave-like interference. Instead of energy hopping randomly from one molecule to another, the system behaves as if it explores several possible routes at the same time, effectively sampling different pathways before settling on the most efficient one. In simple terms, the energy behaves somewhat like a quantum wave searching through the network of molecules to find the quickest route to the reaction center. This observation suggested that quantum coherence might assist the energy transfer process, allowing photosynthetic systems to achieve their remarkable efficiency. Other research groups soon began exploring similar phenomena. One notable contributor is physicist Alexandra Olaya Castro at University College London. Her research has focused on developing theoretical models that describe how quantum effects could influence energy transport within biological systems. Olaya Castro and her collaborators have studied how quantum coherence might persist long enough inside certain molecular structures to influence biological function. Their work has shown that under the right conditions, quantum interactions can actually enhance the efficiency of energy transfer rather than disrupt it. In some cases, the presence of environmental noise can even help maintain optimal energy flow by preventing the system from becoming trapped in less efficient configurations. This counterintuitive interplay between quantum coherence and environmental interactions is sometimes referred to as noise-assisted transport. The idea is that a moderate level of environmental disturbance can guide energy through complex molecular networks in ways that improve overall efficiency. These discoveries revealed an important insight. Quantum effects are not necessarily fragile curiosities confined to carefully controlled laboratory experiments. Under certain circumstances, biological systems may be able to harness them in useful ways. Another fascinating example comes from the behavior of migratory birds. Many species of birds undertake extraordinary seasonal journeys, traveling thousands of miles across continents and oceans. To navigate these long distances, birds rely on several sensory cues, including the position of the sun, patterns of stars, and landmarks on the ground. But they also possess an additional sense known as magnetoreception. Magnetoreception is the ability to detect Earth's magnetic field and use it as a navigational reference. This ability allows birds to orient themselves even when visual landmarks are absent. The mechanism behind this sense puzzled scientists for many years. One leading explanation involves specialized proteins known as cryptochromes. These proteins are found in the eyes of certain birds and other animals. When cryptochromes absorb light, they undergo chemical reactions that create pairs of electrons whose quantum states become linked in a phenomenon called spin correlation. In quantum physics, electron spin is a fundamental property that can be thought of as a kind of intrinsic angular momentum. When two electrons are created together in a chemical reaction, their spins may become correlated in ways that depend on magnetic fields. According to the radical pair mechanism proposed by researchers, including Klaus Schulten at the University of Illinois, Earth's magnetic field may influence the quantum spin states of these electron pairs inside cryptochrome molecules. These tiny changes in spin dynamics could alter the chemical outcomes of the reactions taking place within the protein. The resulting signals might then be detected by the bird's visual system, allowing the animal to perceive directional information related to the planet's magnetic field. While many details of this mechanism are still under investigation, experimental evidence continues to support the involvement of cryptochrome proteins in magnetic sensing. What makes this example especially intriguing is that the quantum states involved must persist long enough to influence biological reactions. Even in the warm, noisy environment of a living cell, these delicate quantum effects appear to survive for surprisingly long periods, at least by quantum standards. Together, discoveries in photosynthesis, magnetoreception, and several other biological processes have gradually changed how scientists think about the relationship between quantum physics and life. Living systems are not merely passive collections of molecules following classical rules. In certain cases, they may actively exploit the strange properties of the quantum world. These findings do not mean that every biological process is quantum mechanical in a meaningful way. Most cellular activities still operate through familiar chemical interactions governed by classical physics. However, the emerging evidence demonstrates that quantum phenomena can persist and influence biological function under the right conditions. That realization opens the door to a fascinating possibility. If quantum effects can survive inside cells, guiding processes such as energy transfer and magnetic sensing, then perhaps they might also appear in other biological systems that are even more complex, and few biological structures are more complex than the human brain. If we look closely at the brain through the lens of neuroscience, an extraordinary picture begins to emerge. Neurons communicate. Electrical signals travel through networks. Chemical messengers influence how signals pass between cells. Entire regions of the brain activate when we see a face, hear music, recall a memory, or make a decision. Modern neuroscience has mapped many of these relationships with impressive precision. Scientists can observe which brain areas become active when a person recognizes a familiar voice, solves a puzzle, or experiences fear. Yet even with all of this progress, something profound remains unexplained. The brain does not merely process information, it experiences things. When you look at a sunset, you do not simply register wavelengths of light between roughly 400 and 700 nanometers. You experience color, the deep reds, the glowing oranges, the gradual fading of light across the sky. When you listen to music, you do not simply detect pressure waves in the air. You experience rhythm, emotion, and melody. When you feel pain, happiness, curiosity, or wonder, those sensations have a subjective quality that exists only from the inside. This inner dimension of experience is often called consciousness, and understanding how consciousness arises from physical processes in the brain is one of the most challenging questions in science. One philosopher who articulated this difficulty clearly is David Chalmers. In the mid-1990s, Chalmers, an Australian philosopher working at the University of Arizona and later at New York University, introduced a distinction that has become widely discussed in both philosophy and neuroscience. He described what he called the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems, despite the name, are not actually easy. They involve explaining how the brain performs various functions. For example, how does the brain recognize objects in the visual field? How does it store and retrieve memories? How does it control movement or focus attention? These questions are difficult, but they are considered approachable through standard scientific methods. Researchers can study neurons, measure electrical activity, observe brain regions, and gradually uncover the mechanisms involved. Over time, neuroscience has made substantial progress on these kinds of questions. The hard problem of consciousness is different. The hard problem asks why physical processes in the brain should produce subjective experience at all. Why does neural activity give rise to an inner world of sensations and feelings? Why does seeing red actually feel like something? Why is there a perspective from the inside? This subjective aspect of experience is sometimes called qualia. The word qualia refers to the raw qualities of experience, the way things appear or feel to a conscious mind. The redness of red, the taste of chocolate, the warmth of sunlight on your skin. From a purely physical standpoint, neurons exchanging electrical signals should not necessarily produce these experiences, yet somehow they do. Chalmers pointed out that even if neuroscience were able to explain every neural mechanism involved in perception and behavior, there would still remain the question of why those mechanisms are accompanied by conscious experience. This observation does not mean that science cannot eventually address the problem. Rather, it highlights how unusual the challenge is. We are attempting to understand how subjective experience emerges from objective physical processes, and that is a puzzle unlike most other scientific problems. Some researchers approach this question by focusing on the neural correlates of consciousness. The phrase neural correlates of consciousness refers to the minimal set of brain processes that are directly associated with conscious experience. If certain patterns of neural activity are consistently present whenever a person reports being aware of something, those patterns may be part of the neural basis of consciousness. One scientist who has spent many years investigating this topic is neuroscientist Christoph Koch. Koch has worked at institutions including the California Institute of Technology and the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle. His research explores how specific neural circuits contribute to conscious perception. Through experiments involving visual awareness, sleep states, and brain imaging, Koch and his collaborators have tried to identify the brain structures most closely associated with conscious experience. One area that appears particularly important is the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the brain responsible for many higher cognitive functions. Within the cortex, certain networks linking the frontal and parietal regions seem to play a role in conscious access to information. Another region, known as the thalamus, acts as a central relay hub connecting many parts of the brain. Some researchers believe interactions between the cortex and the thalamus help coordinate the neural activity associated with awareness. These studies are gradually revealing how different parts of the brain contribute to the processes underlying conscious perception. But even if scientists can identify the neural circuits involved, the deeper philosophical question still remains. Why should those circuits produce experience in the first place? One attempt to address this question comes from a theory known as integrated information theory. Integrated information theory was developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Tononi began by considering several basic properties of conscious experience. First, conscious experience is unified. At any given moment, your experience forms a single integrated scene rather than a collection of disconnected pieces. Second, it is informative. Every conscious state contains a rich structure of distinctions and relationships. Third, it is specific. The experience of hearing music is very different from the experience of tasting food or seeing a landscape. Integrated information theory attempts to connect these properties with the physical organization of a system. The theory proposes that consciousness corresponds to the amount of integrated information generated by a system. In other words, a system is conscious to the extent that its internal components interact in ways that create unified patterns of information that cannot be reduced to independent parts. Tononi introduced a quantity called phi, spelled phi, to represent the level of integrated information present in a system. In simplified terms, a system with a higher phi value has more integrated internal interactions, and therefore, according to the theory, a richer form of consciousness. A simple device such as a digital camera sensor might detect light and process signals, but its internal structure is largely modular and does not integrate information in a unified way. As a result, integrated information theory predicts that such a device would have extremely low or essentially non-existent consciousness. The human brain, on the other hand, contains billions of neurons interacting in complex recurrent networks. These networks integrate information across many regions simultaneously, potentially producing extremely high levels of integrated information. Under Tononi's framework, this rich integration may correspond to the vivid, unified experience we call consciousness. Integrated information theory remains controversial and continues to be debated among neuroscientists and philosophers. Measuring integrated information in real biological systems is extremely difficult, and the theory raises challenging philosophical implications. However, it represents one of several serious attempts to bridge the gap between physical processes and subjective experience. What becomes clear from all of these efforts is that consciousness remains one of the deepest mysteries in modern science. We understand many details about how neurons fire, how signals propagate through circuits, and how different regions of the brain interact. Yet the connection between those physical processes and the inner world of experience is still not fully understood. Some researchers believe that continued progress in neuroscience will eventually reveal the answer. Others wonder whether new principles of physics might be involved, and it is precisely this possibility that has led a small number of scientists to consider whether the strange principles of quantum mechanics might somehow play a role in the story of consciousness. Among the scientists who have taken the question of consciousness into deeper and sometimes controversial territory is a British mathematical physicist named Roger Penrose. Penrose spent much of his career at the University of Oxford, where he became widely respected for his work in mathematical physics, particularly in the study of black holes and the geometry of space-time. Alongside physicist Stephen Hawking, Penrose helped develop the mathematical framework describing gravitational singularities, regions where gravity becomes so intense that the known laws of physics begin to break down. His work earned him the Nobel Prize in Physics in the year 2020. Yet beyond his contributions to cosmology and general relativity, Penrose has long been fascinated by another question entirely. What is the nature of human understanding? More specifically, can human consciousness be explained as a form of computation? During the late 20th century, many researchers in artificial intelligence and cognitive science began treating the brain as a biological computer. According to this view, thoughts arise from information processing carried out by networks of neurons, much like calculations performed by electronic circuits in digital machines. This perspective became known as computationalism. Under computationalism, the mind is essentially a program running on the hardware of the brain. In principle, if scientists could replicate the correct computational processes inside a machine, that machine might display intelligence or even consciousness similar to a human mind. Penrose was skeptical of this idea. In 1989, he published a widely discussed book titled The Emperor's New Mind. The title is a playful reference to the famous Hans Christian Andersen story The Emperor's New Clothes, suggesting that some confident claims about artificial intelligence might be missing something fundamental. In this book, Penrose explored whether the human mind might possess abilities that cannot be fully captured by classical computation. To explain his reasoning, he drew on ideas from mathematical logic. One of the key results in 20th century mathematics is Gödel's incompleteness theorem, discovered by Austrian logician Kurt Gödel in 1931. Gödel's theorem applies to formal mathematical systems capable of expressing basic arithmetic. It states that within any sufficiently powerful formal system, there will always exist true statements that cannot be proven using the rules of that system. In other words, no formal system of mathematical rules can prove all true statements about numbers. Penrose argued that human mathematicians appear capable of recognizing the truth of certain mathematical statements, even when those statements cannot be formally proven within a given system. If this interpretation is correct, it suggests that human understanding might involve something beyond the capabilities of a purely rule-based computational process. In a classical computer, every operation follows explicit instructions. Algorithms define how data is processed step by step. Even the most complex artificial intelligence systems ultimately rely on sequences of operations that follow predetermined rules. Penrose proposed that human insight, particularly mathematical insight, might involve a form of reasoning that cannot be reduced to algorithmic computation. This idea led him to consider whether some non-computational physical process might be occurring inside the brain. If human consciousness involves processes that go beyond classical algorithms, then the physical mechanisms underlying those processes might also extend beyond classical physics. This possibility led Penrose toward quantum mechanics. Quantum physics already introduces phenomena that do not behave like classical computation. Quantum systems can exist in superpositions, explore multiple possibilities simultaneously, and evolve according to probabilistic laws rather than strictly deterministic ones. In quantum computing, for example, a quantum bit, often called a qubit, can represent a superposition of states rather than a single binary value. A classical bit must always be either 0 or 1. A qubit can exist in a combination of 0 and 1 simultaneously. This property allows quantum computers to perform certain calculations far more efficiently than classical machines, particularly when exploring large spaces of possibilities. However, Penrose did not simply argue that the brain might function like a quantum computer. His proposal was more radical. He suggested that consciousness might involve a specific physical process related to the collapse of quantum states. In standard interpretations of quantum mechanics, a quantum system evolves according to a mathematical rule called the Schrödinger equation, until a measurement occurs. At that point, the wave function describing the system appears to collapse into a definite outcome. Exactly what triggers this collapse remains an open question in physics. Penrose proposed that the collapse of quantum states might not simply be caused by observation or measurement in the usual sense. Instead, he suggested that gravity itself might play a role. According to Penrose's hypothesis, when a quantum system involves different possible states that correspond to significantly different spacetime geometries, the system cannot remain in superposition indefinitely. At some point, the instability between these geometries causes the quantum state to collapse into a single outcome. This idea is sometimes called objective reduction. The term objective reduction refers to a spontaneous physical collapse of the quantum wave function that occurs due to fundamental physical principles rather than observation by an external observer. Penrose speculated that such objective reductions might occur within the brain, and that these events could be connected to moments of conscious awareness. This was a bold suggestion. At the time, most neuroscientists were focused on classical explanations involving networks of neurons and electrochemical signaling. The idea that quantum gravitational effects might be relevant to brain function seemed extremely unconventional. Penrose himself was not a neuroscientist, and he recognized that identifying a biological structure capable of supporting quantum processes would be essential for his hypothesis. This is where collaboration became important. Around the early 1990s, Penrose began working with an anesthesiologist and researcher named Stuart Hameroff at the University of Arizona. Hameroff had been studying the internal structure of neurons and was particularly interested in microscopic components called microtubules. Microtubules are cylindrical protein structures found inside many types of cells. They form part of the cell's internal skeleton, known as the cytoskeleton, and they play important roles in maintaining cell shape, transporting materials, and organizing cellular structures. Hameroff proposed that microtubules might possess properties allowing them to support quantum processes. If this were true, microtubules could provide the physical environment necessary for the kind of quantum events Penrose had been considering. Together, Penrose and Hameroff began developing a theoretical framework connecting quantum physics, microtubules, and consciousness. Their joint proposal would later become known as orchestrated objective reduction, and it would become one of the most widely discussed and debated ideas linking quantum mechanics to the human mind. To explore how quantum processes might influence consciousness, Roger Penrose eventually joined forces with a scientist from a very different field of medicine. His collaborator was Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona. Anesthesiology may seem like an unusual place to search for answers about consciousness, yet it actually raises some of the most direct questions about the nature of awareness. When a patient receives general anesthesia, consciousness disappears. The person does not merely fall asleep in the everyday sense. Instead, awareness itself seems to vanish, often returning only when the effects of the anesthetic wear off. For Hameroff, this phenomenon suggested that understanding how anesthetic drugs disrupt brain function might reveal clues about how consciousness normally arises. Many anesthetic compounds interact with proteins inside neurons. Some of these proteins are embedded in the membranes of nerve cells, influencing how electrical signals propagate. Others are located deeper within the cellular structure. Hameroff became particularly interested in a microscopic structural system inside neurons known as microtubules. Microtubules are tiny cylindrical structures that form part of the cytoskeleton, the internal framework that supports the shape and organization of cells. They exist not only in neurons, but in nearly every type of eukaryotic cell found in plants, animals, and fungi. Each microtubule is composed of repeating protein units called tubulin. Tubulin proteins assemble into long chains that curve around to form hollow tubes. The outer diameter of a microtubule is about 25 nanometers, while the hollow interior has a diameter of roughly 15 nanometers. To visualize this scale, imagine shrinking a human hair until it was as wide as a large bridge. A microtubule would then be closer to the width of a narrow road running along that bridge. Despite their small size, microtubules are extremely important to cellular function. They help maintain the shape of cells. They provide tracks along which molecular motors carry cargo from one part of the cell to another. They also play key roles during cell division by organizing the movement of chromosomes. Inside neurons, microtubules are particularly abundant. They run along the length of axons and dendrites, helping maintain the structure of these long branching extensions. Hameroff began wondering whether microtubules might do more than simply provide structural support. The tubulin proteins that form microtubules contain complex arrangements of charged atoms. These charges can shift slightly as the protein changes shape. Some researchers had proposed that these changes might influence how electrical signals move through neurons. Hameroff took the idea further. He suggested that microtubules might support information processing within the cell, acting almost like microscopic computational elements embedded inside neurons. If this were true, then neurons might contain an additional layer of processing occurring beneath the familiar electrochemical signaling at synapses. When Hameroff encountered Penrose's ideas about quantum processes and consciousness, the two scientists realized their hypotheses might intersect. Penrose had proposed that consciousness could involve a physical process called objective reduction, a spontaneous collapse of quantum states related to fundamental properties of spacetime. Hameroff believed that microtubules might provide the biological environment where such quantum processes could occur. Together they developed a theory known as orchestrated objective reduction, often abbreviated as OR. The name describes the central concept of the theory. Objective reduction refers to the spontaneous collapse of quantum states proposed by Penrose. The term orchestrated suggests that these collapses are coordinated by biological structures inside neurons. According to OR, quantum states can arise within networks of tubulin proteins inside microtubules. These quantum states may involve superpositions of different molecular configurations. For a brief period, these states could evolve according to the rules of quantum mechanics, exploring multiple possibilities simultaneously. Eventually, the superposition would collapse through objective reduction, producing a definite outcome. Hameroff and Penrose proposed that each of these collapse events corresponds to a discrete moment of conscious experience. In this framework, consciousness does not emerge from continuous neural activity alone. Instead, it arises from a sequence of quantum state reductions occurring inside microtubules throughout the brain. These events are thought to occur extremely rapidly. Some versions of the OR model suggest that such quantum state reductions might take place roughly 40 times per second, a frequency similar to certain patterns of electrical activity observed in the brain known as gamma oscillations. Gamma oscillations are rhythmic patterns of neural firing often associated with attention, perception, and conscious awareness. Hameroff and Penrose proposed that coordinated activity among many neurons could synchronize microtubule quantum states across larger regions of the brain. In this way, microtubules inside billions of neurons might collectively contribute to conscious processing. The term orchestrated in OR refers to this coordination. Neural activity, chemical signals, and cellular processes could help organize when and where quantum state reductions occur. These orchestrated reductions would then influence neuronal firing patterns, feeding back into the larger neural networks that shape perception and thought. In other words, OR proposes a two-level system. At one level, classical neural activity takes place through synaptic signaling and electrical impulses. At a deeper level, quantum processes inside microtubules generate discrete events that contribute to conscious experience. This hypothesis also offers an explanation for the effects of anesthesia. Many anesthetic molecules bind to hydrophobic pockets within proteins. Hameroff suggested that some anesthetics may disrupt quantum processes occurring within tubulin proteins, thereby interfering with the microtubule activity proposed by OR. If microtubule quantum states are essential for consciousness, then disrupting them could suppress awareness. Although this idea remains highly debated, it offers an intriguing link between molecular biology and the disappearance of consciousness during anesthesia. It is important to note that OR remains a theoretical model rather than an experimentally confirmed mechanism. The idea that quantum states could persist long enough inside the warm and noisy environment of the brain is controversial. Many physicists and neuroscientists argue that interactions with surrounding molecules would cause quantum coherence to vanish almost instantly. Even so, the OR hypothesis has stimulated a great deal of discussion across several fields, including physics, neuroscience, philosophy, and molecular biology. Part of its appeal lies in its attempt to bridge two deep scientific mysteries. The first is the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, the question of how and why quantum possibilities collapse into definite outcomes. The second is the mystery of consciousness, the question of how subjective experience arises from physical processes. By linking these two puzzles together, Penrose and Hameroff proposed that solving one might help illuminate the other. Whether Ochoa ultimately proves correct or not, it has played an important role in expanding the conversation about consciousness beyond traditional boundaries. And as often happens in science, bold ideas tend to attract both curiosity and skepticism. Many researchers soon began examining the proposal closely, asking whether the physical conditions required by Ochoa could realistically exist inside the brain. One physicist in particular set out to test that question using detailed calculations. When a new scientific idea appears, especially one that connects fields as different as quantum physics and neuroscience, it rarely travels very far without attracting careful scrutiny. In the case of the Ochoa proposal, developed by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, one of the most influential critiques came from a physicist named Max Tegmark. Tegmark is a theoretical physicist who has worked at institutions including the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, commonly known as MIT. His research spans several areas of physics and cosmology, including the large-scale structure of the universe, the foundations of quantum mechanics, and questions related to the nature of reality. But in the late 1990s, Tegmark turned his attention to the possibility of quantum processes occurring inside the brain. His approach was not philosophical, it was mathematical and physical. If quantum states were truly involved in brain function, Tegmark reasoned, it should be possible to estimate how long those states could survive within the physical environment of neural tissue. The key concept here is quantum coherence. Quantum coherence refers to the condition in which a quantum system maintains a well-defined relationship between multiple possible states. When a particle or molecule exists in a superposition of states, the components of that superposition must remain phase-related in a precise way. This delicate relationship allows quantum systems to display behaviors such as interference and superposition. However, coherence is extremely fragile. When a quantum system interacts with its environment, those interactions tend to disrupt the phase relationships between the components of the superposition. Once those relationships are lost, the system behaves like an ordinary classical object. This process is known as quantum decoherence. Decoherence does not require an observer in the everyday sense. It simply occurs when a quantum system becomes entangled with surrounding particles in its environment. In practice, that environment can include nearby molecules, photons, thermal vibrations, or any other interaction that carries away information about the quantum state. To appreciate how quickly decoherence can occur, consider a simple analogy. Imagine trying to keep a delicate soap bubble intact in the middle of a crowded dance floor. Every movement of the dancers represents a collision or disturbance. Under those conditions, the bubble is unlikely to survive for long. Similarly, quantum coherence tends to vanish rapidly in environments filled with thermal motion and molecular collisions. The brain, unfortunately for quantum states, is precisely such an environment. Neural tissue is warm, roughly at body temperature. Molecules are constantly vibrating and moving. Water molecules collide with proteins billions of times every second. Electrical activity flows through membranes and ion channels. In other words, it is not exactly the quiet, isolated laboratory environment where delicate quantum experiments are usually performed. Tegmark set out to estimate how quickly decoherence would occur if quantum superpositions were present inside neurons or microtubules. In 1999, he published a paper titled The Importance of Quantum Decoherence in Brain Processes. In this analysis, Tegmark used known physical parameters for neural tissue to calculate how rapidly environmental interactions would disrupt quantum states. He considered several possible scenarios, including superpositions involving ion positions inside neurons and hypothetical quantum states within microtubules. His calculations suggested something striking. The predicted decoherence times were extraordinarily short. In some cases, the coherence time came out to be on the order of 10 to the minus 13 seconds. That number is easier to grasp when translated into words. 10 to the minus 13 seconds is 1/10 trillionth of a second. To put that into perspective, a typical neural firing event, the action potential travelling along a neuron, lasts about 1 millisecond. 1 millisecond is 1,000th of a second. Comparing those timescales reveals a dramatic difference. The decoherence times estimated by Tegmark were roughly 10 billion times shorter than the timescale of ordinary neural activity. In practical terms, this means that any delicate quantum superpositions inside neurons would likely be destroyed almost instantly by interactions with surrounding molecules. According to Tegmark's analysis, the warm and wet environment of the brain would cause quantum coherence to vanish long before it could influence neural signaling or cognition. From this perspective, the brain behaves essentially as a classical system. Neurons communicate through electrochemical signals. Ion channels open and close according to voltage differences. Neurotransmitters diffuse across synapses. All of these processes operate comfortably within the framework of classical physics and chemistry. Tegmark's conclusion was therefore straightforward. While quantum mechanics certainly governs the behavior of atoms and molecules at fundamental levels, the large-scale processes responsible for brain activity are overwhelmingly classical. The extraordinary complexity of neural networks does not require quantum computation or quantum state collapse to explain how the brain processes information. Instead, the classical interactions among billions of neurons appear sufficient. This critique posed a serious challenge to theories like Auchoar. If Tegmark's decoherence calculations were correct, then quantum states inside microtubules would collapse far too quickly to influence neural activity in any meaningful way. In effect, the environment of the brain would continuously destroy the very quantum states that such theories rely upon. Many physicists and neuroscientists found Tegmark's argument persuasive. The calculations were grounded in known physical principles, and the predicted timescale seemed incompatible with sustained quantum coherence inside neural structures. For a time, this critique appeared to close the door on the idea that quantum effects could play a functional role in brain processes. Yet science rarely ends with a single calculation. Supporters of quantum brain theories began examining Tegmark's assumptions, questioning whether the physical models he used accurately represented the conditions inside microtubules. Some researchers proposed that certain biological structures might provide partial shielding from environmental noise. Others suggested that collective quantum effects might behave differently from the simplified scenarios Tegmark analyzed. Whether those counterarguments hold up under experimental scrutiny remains an open question. But Tegmark's analysis served an important role. It forced advocates of quantum brain theories to confront the central physical challenge directly. If quantum processes truly occur inside the brain, they must somehow survive the relentless disturbance of the biological environment, and explaining how that could happen remains one of the most difficult obstacles any quantum theory of consciousness must overcome. Long before the modern debates about quantum consciousness began, another physicist had already proposed that biological systems might possess subtle forms of organized physical activity that go beyond simple chemistry. His name was Herbert Froelich. Froelich was a German-born theoretical physicist who later worked for many years at the University of Liverpool in the United Kingdom. His research covered several areas of solid-state physics, including the behavior of electrons in crystalline materials. But during the 1960s and 1970s, Froelich became interested in a question that lay somewhat outside the traditional boundaries of physics. Could living systems exhibit forms of organized energy similar to those observed in certain physical systems? In particular, Froelich wondered whether biological structures containing electric charges might support coherent oscillations. To understand what he meant, it helps to consider how molecules behave inside living cells. Many biological molecules carry electrical charges or electric dipoles. A dipole is a pair of separated charges, one positive and one negative, connected through a molecular structure. Proteins, membranes, and other cellular components often contain these charge distributions. When charged molecules interact with electric fields or thermal energy, they can begin to vibrate or oscillate. Normally, these oscillations are random and uncoordinated. Each molecule moves independently, influenced by collisions with surrounding molecules and thermal fluctuations. However, Froelich proposed that under certain conditions something more organized might occur. He suggested that when biological systems receive a continuous supply of metabolic energy, that energy might drive coherent oscillations among many molecular dipoles simultaneously. Instead of vibrating randomly, large numbers of molecules could begin oscillating together in a synchronized pattern. This phenomenon would resemble what physicists call coherence. In physics, Coherence refers to a situation where many oscillating elements maintain a consistent phase relationship with one another. A familiar example occurs in lasers. In a laser beam, photons are emitted with the same frequency and phase, producing an extremely ordered form of light. Froelich speculated that biological systems might generate a somewhat similar form of ordered oscillation among molecular structures. His proposal became known as the Froelich coherence hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, biological systems that receive a steady input of energy could channel part of that energy into a single collective vibrational mode. Instead of distributing energy randomly among many molecular motions, the system would concentrate energy into one coherent oscillation involving large numbers of molecules. Froelich described this process using mathematical models similar to those used in condensed matter physics. In simplified terms, the system behaves somewhat like a collection of coupled oscillators that suddenly lock into a shared rhythm. If such coherence were possible in biological structures, it could produce highly organized electrical vibrations within cells. Froelich suggested that these oscillations might occur in cellular membranes. Cell membranes are thin layers composed primarily of lipid molecules and embedded proteins. Many of these molecules contain electric dipoles, and the membrane itself forms a structured environment where charges and electric fields interact. Under Froelich's model, metabolic energy flowing through the cell could excite coherent oscillations within these dipolar structures. These oscillations would occur at extremely high frequencies, possibly in the gigahertz or even terahertz range. To give a sense of scale, a gigahertz corresponds to 1 billion oscillations per second. Such rapid vibrations would not be detectable through ordinary sensory experience, but they might influence molecular interactions within the cell. Froelich also suggested that similar oscillatory behavior might appear in other cellular structures containing organized arrays of molecules. Microtubules, the cylindrical protein structures found throughout the cytoskeleton of cells, are one possible example. Microtubules are built from repeating tubulin proteins arranged in long-ordered lattices. Because these proteins contain electric dipoles and are arranged in highly regular patterns, some researchers have proposed that they could support collective vibrational modes. If many tubulin molecules oscillated together coherently, the resulting electromagnetic patterns might extend across large regions of the microtubule. Such coherent vibrations could potentially influence how proteins interact with one another, or how signals propagate through the cell. In this sense, Froelich coherence might represent a form of long-range organization within biological matter. Instead of each molecule acting independently, large groups of molecules could behave as coordinated systems. Some researchers have speculated that this kind of collective behavior might assist biological information processing. For example, coherent oscillations might help synchronize activity across different regions of a cell. They might influence how energy moves through molecular networks. They could even contribute to communication between cellular structures. In neuroscience, certain patterns of electrical oscillation already play important roles at the level of neural networks. Brain activity often displays rhythmic patterns known as neural oscillations. These oscillations occur at frequencies ranging from slow delta waves during deep sleep to faster gamma waves associated with attention and perception. While neural oscillations occur at much larger scales than the molecular vibrations proposed by Froelich, the idea of coherence appears at multiple levels of biological organization. In principle, coherent molecular vibrations inside cells could interact with larger-scale electrical patterns in neural networks. At least that is the possibility some researchers have explored. It is important to emphasize that Froelich's ideas remain largely theoretical. Detecting coherent molecular oscillations inside living cells is extremely difficult. The signals involved are very small, and the biological environment is full of thermal noise and molecular motion. Over the years, some experimental groups have attempted to search for signatures of Froelich-type coherence in biological materials. Certain studies have reported evidence of collective vibrational modes in protein assemblies or membrane structures, but the results remain debated and are not universally accepted. Nevertheless, Froelich's hypothesis has had a lasting influence. His work encouraged scientists to think about biological systems not only as collections of chemical reactions, but also as physical systems capable of organized dynamic behavior. In particular, the idea that coherent oscillations might arise within cellular structures has attracted attention from researchers studying the possible quantum aspects of biology. For scientists exploring quantum theories of consciousness, Froelich coherence provides a potential mechanism by which biological systems might sustain organized quantum-like behavior. If coherent vibrations could occur within structures such as microtubules, they might create conditions where quantum effects could persist longer than expected in a warm biological environment. Whether this actually happens remains uncertain, but the concept has helped inspire decades of research at the intersection of physics, biology, and neuroscience. And in science, even speculative ideas can prove valuable when they open new ways of thinking about familiar systems. Sometimes the most important role of a hypothesis is not that it provides the final answer, but that it encourages researchers to ask deeper questions about how life and physics might interact in ways we're only beginning to understand. While some researchers have focused on microscopic structures inside neurons, others have explored a very different possibility. Instead of looking for quantum processes inside individual molecules, they have asked whether the brain as a whole might be better understood using concepts from quantum field theory. This line of thinking gave rise to a framework known as quantum brain dynamics. The idea was developed in part by a Japanese physicist named Hirumi Umezawa, along with later contributions from Italian physicist Giuseppe Vitiello and several collaborators. Umezawa had spent much of his career studying quantum field theory, which is the mathematical framework used to describe how quantum particles emerge from underlying fields. In classical physics, a particle is often imagined as a small object moving through space. Quantum field theory takes a different view. According to quantum field theory, the fundamental entities of nature are fields that exist throughout space. Particles such as electrons or photons appear as localized excitations within these fields. A useful analogy is the surface of a calm lake. The lake itself represents the underlying field. When a disturbance occurs, ripples appear on the surface. Those ripples move across the water, but they are not separate objects floating on top of the lake. They are patterns of motion within the water itself. In a similar way, particles in quantum field theory are ripples in deeper physical fields. Umezawa began wondering whether similar ideas might help explain certain aspects of brain activity. In particular, he was interested in the nature of memory. Memory is one of the most remarkable capabilities of the brain. Human beings can store vast amounts of information across decades. A person might remember the face of a childhood friend, the melody of a song heard years earlier, or the smell of a particular place. Yet from a purely biological perspective, neurons are constantly changing. Proteins are replaced. Synapses strengthen or weaken. Molecules move in and out of cells. Despite this constant turnover, memories can persist for long periods. Umezawa wondered how such stable information could exist within a biological system that is continuously in motion. He proposed that memory might not be stored solely in individual neurons or specific synapses. Instead, memory might correspond to patterns of activity within quantum fields associated with the brain. In this model, the brain functions as a complex physical system interacting with surrounding fields. When information is encoded, it produces a change in the organization of those fields. These changes can form stable patterns known as ordered states. In quantum field theory, ordered states can arise when many particles behave collectively. One familiar example appears in the physics of superconductors. In certain materials cooled to very low temperatures, electrons begin moving in coordinated pairs known as Cooper pairs. These pairs behave collectively, allowing electrical current to flow without resistance. Although the brain operates at much higher temperatures than superconductors, Umezawa suggested that biological systems might still exhibit forms of collective organization. He proposed that memory could involve collective excitations within fields associated with brain activity. These excitations are sometimes described using the term quasiparticles. A quasiparticle is not a fundamental particle like an electron or photon. Instead, it represents a pattern of collective motion within a system. For example, in a crystal lattice, vibrations of atoms can behave as if they were particles called phonons. Similarly, Umezawa suggested that patterns of excitation in brain-related fields might behave as quasi-particles that encode information. In this framework, memory is not located in a single neuron. Instead, it corresponds to a distributed pattern spread across many interacting components of the system. Giuseppe Vitiello later expanded and refined these ideas. Vitiello worked extensively on applying quantum field theory to complex systems, including biological and cognitive processes. He proposed that the brain could be modeled as an open quantum system interacting continuously with its environment. an open system exchanges energy and information with its surroundings. The brain constantly receives sensory input, processes signals, and produces actions. This dynamic interaction may influence the formation of ordered patterns within its underlying physical fields. According to the quantum brain dynamics framework, memories arise when the brain enters particular ordered states created through interactions among many microscopic components. These ordered states are associated with long-range correlations in the system. Long-range correlations mean that changes occurring in one region of the system influence activity across large distances. In other words, the system behaves as a coordinated whole rather than a collection of isolated parts. This concept is important because the brain itself displays large-scale coordinated activity. Electroencephalography recordings often reveal rhythmic patterns spreading across different brain regions. Networks of neurons synchronize their activity during certain cognitive tasks. Quantum brain dynamics attempts to describe these large-scale patterns using tools from quantum field theory. Instead of treating the brain as a set of independent neurons exchanging signals, the model emphasizes collective behavior emerging from interactions across many levels. In this view, brain states correspond to specific configurations of field activity. Different patterns represent different memories or perceptual states. When the brain transitions from one state to another, the underlying fields reorganize into new patterns. Vitiello also suggested that the brain might maintain multiple possible configurations simultaneously, somewhat reminiscent of quantum superposition, although not necessarily identical to the microscopic quantum states studied in atomic physics. The mathematical language of quantum field theory provides tools for describing how such patterns could emerge and evolve. One of the appealing aspects of this approach is that it naturally explains how information might be distributed across large networks. If memory corresponds to a global field pattern, then damage to a small region of the brain might not completely erase that memory. Instead, the pattern could remain partially intact within the larger system. This idea echoes observations in neuroscience suggesting that many memories are stored in distributed networks rather than single locations. However, it is important to understand that quantum brain dynamics remains a theoretical framework. Although the mathematics of quantum field theory is well established in particle physics, applying it directly to biological systems is extremely challenging. The brain is a warm, noisy environment filled with chemical interactions, and determining whether quantum field effects play a significant role remains an open question. Even so, the theory has influenced how some researchers think about the relationship between physics and cognition. Rather than focusing exclusively on individual neurons or molecular structures, quantum brain dynamics encourages scientists to consider the brain as a complex physical system exhibiting collective behavior. In this perspective, consciousness and memory might arise not only from localized interactions, but from large-scale patterns emerging across the entire system. Whether or not quantum field theory ultimately proves essential to understanding the brain, the framework represents another attempt to bridge two fields that rarely overlap. Physics seeks the fundamental laws governing matter and energy. Neuroscience seeks to understand the physical basis of thought and experience. Quantum brain dynamics stands as one of several efforts to bring those two scientific traditions into conversation. In the effort to understand consciousness, some researchers have explored ideas that do not begin with neurons or molecules at all, but instead with the deeper structure of physical reality itself. One physicist who approached the problem from this broader perspective was David Bohm. Bohm was a theoretical physicist who worked on quantum mechanics, plasma physics, and the philosophy of science. He spent time at institutions such as Princeton University and later at Birkbeck College in London. Throughout his career, he became increasingly interested in the conceptual foundations of physics. While most physicists were focused on calculations and experimental predictions, Bohm asked a more philosophical question. What does quantum theory tell us about the nature of reality itself? In the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, physical systems are described by wave functions that evolve according to mathematical equations until a measurement occurs. At that moment, the system appears to settle into one definite outcome. Bohm was dissatisfied with the idea that observation alone somehow causes this transition. Instead, he proposed an alternative interpretation of quantum mechanics, in which particles always possess definite positions guided by a deeper underlying structure known as the pilot wave. But beyond this technical interpretation, Bohm developed a broader philosophical framework describing the relationship between observable reality and deeper levels of order. He He called these levels the explicate order and the implicate order. The explicate order is the world of everyday experience. It includes the objects we see around us, the positions of particles, the shapes of galaxies, and the familiar structures of matter. In the explicate order, things appear separate from one another. A tree stands apart from a mountain. A star exists independently of a planet. But Bohm proposed that beneath this visible level lies a deeper layer of reality known as the implicate order. In the implicate order, the universe is fundamentally interconnected. Instead of separate objects interacting from the outside, everything emerges from an underlying holistic structure. Bohm often used the analogy of a hologram to illustrate this idea. A hologram is a three-dimensional image created using interference patterns of light. When laser light is reflected from an object and combined with a reference beam, it produces an intricate pattern of bright and dark regions on a photographic plate. This pattern may look meaningless to the naked eye, yet when the plate is illuminated with the correct light, the original three-dimensional image reappears. One remarkable property of holograms is that information about the entire image is distributed across the whole plate. If you cut a holographic plate into smaller pieces, each fragment can still reconstruct the entire image, though with reduced resolution. In other words, the information is not stored in one specific location. Instead, it is distributed across the interference pattern. Bohm suggested that reality itself might function in a similar way. According to his view, the visible world unfolds from deeper patterns of information embedded in the implicate order. Objects appear separate in the explicate order, but they remain connected through the underlying structure of the implicate order. While Bohm was developing these ideas in physics, a neuroscientist named Karl Pribram was studying the structure of the brain. Pribram worked for many years at institutions including Stanford University and George Washington University. His research focused on how the brain processes sensory information and stores memories. One puzzle that interested Pribram involved the way memories appear to be distributed throughout the brain. Earlier experiments had already hinted at this phenomenon. In the 1920s and 1930s, neuroscientist Carl Lashley conducted studies in which he trained rats to navigate mazes. After the animals learned the task, Lashley removed small sections of their cerebral cortex to see how memory would be affected. If memories were stored in specific locations, removing the relevant region should have completely erased the learned behavior. Instead, Lashley found that removing small areas of cortex did not eliminate the memory entirely. The rats could still perform the task, although sometimes with reduced accuracy. The results suggested that memories were not stored in single isolated locations. Rather, memory seemed to be distributed across larger networks of brain tissue. Pribram began searching for a theoretical model that could explain this distributed storage. When he encountered Bohm's discussions of holography, he noticed an intriguing parallel. In a hologram, the information describing the entire image is encoded in interference patterns distributed across the medium. Pribram wondered whether the brain might store information in a similar way. This idea became known as the holonomic brain theory. The term holonomic comes from the word hologram, combined with the concept of holistic organization. According to Pribram's model, memories may not be stored as discrete units inside individual neurons. Instead, they might be encoded in patterns of interference produced by waves of neural activity. When neurons fire, they generate electrical signals that propagate through networks of cells. These signals can interact with one another, creating patterns of constructive and destructive interference. Constructive interference occurs when waves combine to produce stronger signals. Destructive interference occurs when waves cancel one another out. In a distributed neural network, such interference patterns could encode information across many neurons simultaneously. Under this view, the brain does not store memories like files in a computer. Instead, it stores them as patterns within the dynamic activity of neural networks. Just as a hologram distributes information across an entire surface, the brain may distribute memory information across many interconnected regions. This concept aligns with observations from modern neuroscience. Brain imaging studies often show that recalling a memory activates multiple areas of the brain, rather than a single localized region. Sensory areas, emotional centers, and associative networks can all participate in the recollection of past experiences. Pribram's holographic model offered one possible explanation for this distributed activity. He also suggested that the mathematics used to analyze holograms Particularly the Fourier transform might play a role in neural information processing. The Fourier transform is a mathematical technique that converts patterns in space or time into patterns of frequency. In optics, it helps describe how interference patterns form in holographic systems. In neuroscience, similar mathematical methods can be used to analyze patterns of neural activity. Although the holonomic brain theory remains speculative, it has influenced how some researchers think about distributed information processing in the brain. The connection between Bohm's implicate order and Pribram's holonomic brain remains largely philosophical, rather than experimentally confirmed. However, the combination of these ideas suggests a striking possibility. If both the universe and the brain involve deeply interconnected patterns of information, then consciousness might emerge from the unfolding of those patterns. In this view, the brain does not merely process information in isolated circuits. Instead, it may participate in a broader web of relationships connecting physical processes across many levels of organization. Whether this picture ultimately proves accurate is still uncertain. But the dialogue between Bohm's holistic physics and Pribram's holographic brain theory continues to inspire researchers exploring the deep connections between mind, matter, and the structure of reality itself. When scientists first began exploring the relationship between quantum mechanics and the mind, many discussions focused on whether the brain might physically operate using quantum processes. But another line of research emerged that took a different approach. Instead of asking whether neurons themselves behave quantum mechanically, some researchers asked whether the mathematics of quantum theory might help explain how people think. This field is known as quantum cognition. Quantum cognition does not claim that the brain is literally a quantum computer, made from qubits and superpositions in the way a laboratory quantum processor might function. Instead, it uses the mathematical structure of quantum probability theory to model certain patterns of human reasoning that classical probability theory struggles to explain. Two researchers who helped develop this approach are Jerome Busemeyer and Peter Bruser. Jerome Busemeyer is a cognitive scientist who has worked at Indiana University. His research focuses on decision-making, judgment, and the mathematical modelling of human thought. Peter Bruser is a researcher associated with the Queensland University of Technology in Australia. His work explores how concepts from quantum theory can be applied to areas such as information retrieval, cognition, and language. Together, Busemeyer and Bruser helped formalize the field of quantum cognition and wrote a detailed book titled Quantum Models of Cognition and Decision. To understand why this approach emerged, it helps to consider how classical probability theory is normally used to describe decision-making. In classical probability, events are assumed to follow consistent logical relationships. If a person is asked about two related questions, the probabilities of different answers should combine in predictable ways, according to the rules of classical statistics. For example, suppose researchers ask people two questions. The first question might be whether a person believes a particular political leader is trustworthy. The second question might ask whether the same leader is competent. Classical probability predicts that the order in which these questions are asked should not significantly influence the final probabilities of the answers. But when psychologists conduct real experiments, something interesting happens. The order of questions often changes the responses. If participants are asked about trustworthiness first and competence second, the distribution of answers can differ noticeably from the distribution obtained when the order of the questions is reversed. This phenomenon is called the order effect. Order effects appear in many areas of human decision-making, including surveys, political polling, and consumer preferences. Classical probability theory struggles to account for these effects without introducing complicated additional assumptions. Quantum probability theory, however, naturally allows such behavior. In quantum theory, the outcome of a measurement can depend on the sequence in which measurements occur. This happens because measuring one property of a system can alter the system's state before the next measurement is made. Quantum cognition researchers realized that the same mathematical framework could describe how answering one question may change a person's mental state before answering another. In this model, a person's beliefs or attitudes are represented as a state within a mathematical space similar to the state space used in quantum mechanics. When a question is asked, it acts like a measurement that changes the state of the system. As a result, the probability of subsequent responses can depend on the order of the questions. Another phenomenon that quantum cognition models help explain is known as the conjunction fallacy. The conjunction fallacy occurs when people judge the probability of two events occurring together as more likely than the probability of one of those events occurring alone. A well-known example was introduced by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. Participants were given a description of a fictional person named Linda. Linda was described as intelligent, outspoken, and concerned with issues of social justice. Participants were then asked which of two statements was more probable. The first statement was that Linda is a bank teller. The second statement was that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. From a classical probability perspective, the probability of both events occurring together must always be less than or equal to the probability of either event alone. Yet many participants judged the second statement to be more likely, because it seemed more consistent with the description. Quantum probability models can describe this effect using interference between mental states, a concept borrowed from quantum mechanics. In quantum systems, probability amplitudes can combine in ways that increase or decrease the likelihood of particular outcomes through constructive or destructive interference. Quantum cognition models use similar mathematical structures to describe how different concepts or associations interact in the human mind. Importantly, this approach does not require that neurons themselves behave as quantum particles. Instead, the brain is treated as a system whose information processing may follow probability rules that resemble those used in quantum theory. In other words, the mathematics of quantum mechanics can serve as a useful tool for describing certain patterns of human reasoning, even if the underlying physical processes remain classical. This distinction is important. Quantum cognition is primarily a mathematical modeling framework rather than a physical theory of the brain. Researchers in this field are interested in whether quantum probability theory provides better predictions of human behavior than traditional statistical models. In many experiments involving decision-making, perception, and conceptual associations, quantum-inspired models have produced surprisingly accurate descriptions of how people actually think. This does not mean that human reasoning is irrational. Rather, it suggests that the structure of human thought may not always follow the strict logical assumptions embedded in classical probability theory. Human cognition often involves context, ambiguity, and shifting mental states. The mathematical language of quantum theory happens to provide tools well suited to describing systems where context influences outcomes. From this perspective, quantum cognition acts as a conceptual bridge between physics and psychology. Concepts originally developed to describe particles and waves are now helping scientists understand patterns of belief, judgment, and perception. The connection is not literal in a physical sense, but it reveals an intriguing possibility. The mathematical structures used in quantum theory may capture something fundamental about systems where possibilities coexist and decisions emerge from complex interactions. And the human mind, with its constant flow of thoughts, possibilities, and interpretations, may be exactly such a system. Several decades ago, the physicist John Archibald Wheeler began exploring an idea that continues to echo through modern discussions of physics, information theory, and even consciousness. Wheeler suggested that the universe might not be built primarily from matter or energy in the traditional sense. Instead, he proposed that information could lie at the deepest level of physical reality. He summarized this idea with a short phrase that has since become famous, it from bit. The word it refers to physical entities such as particles, fields, atoms, and galaxies. The word bit refers to a unit of information, the simplest possible distinction between two alternatives. In digital systems, a bit represents a choice between 0 and 1. Wheeler's suggestion was that every physical thing might ultimately arise from answers to yes or no questions. According to this view, the fabric of the universe is woven not only from matter and energy, but also from information. To understand why this idea gained attention, it helps to look at how quantum physics describes reality. In quantum mechanics, particles do not possess definite properties until measurements occur. Instead, they are described by wave functions representing a range of possible outcomes. When a measurement is performed, the system yields a specific result. This result can be thought of as an answer to a question posed by the measurement apparatus. Is the electron located here or somewhere else? Is the photon polarized in this direction or that direction? Each measurement generates a piece of information. Wheeler speculated that the accumulation of such informational events might actually give rise to the physical world we observe. This perspective aligns naturally with a growing area of research known as quantum information science. In quantum information theory, the focus shifts from particles themselves to the information they carry and how that information can be manipulated. One physicist who has played a central role in this field is Anton Zeilinger. Zeilinger is an Austrian physicist who worked for many years at the University of Vienna and later directed the Institute for Quantum Optics and Quantum Information of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. His research has focused on some of the most intriguing phenomena in quantum mechanics, including quantum entanglement and quantum teleportation. Quantum entanglement is one of the most puzzling features of quantum theory. When two particles become entangled, their properties become correlated in a way that cannot be explained by classical physics. Even if the particles are separated by large distances, measuring one instantly determines the state of the other. Albert Einstein famously referred to this phenomenon as spooky action at a distance. Experiments conducted over the past several decades have repeatedly confirmed that entanglement is real. In fact, Anton Zeilinger and his colleagues performed several landmark experiments demonstrating entanglement between photons separated by significant distances. These experiments tested a set of theoretical predictions known as Bell inequalities, originally proposed by physicist John Bell in 1964. Bell's work showed that if the universe obeyed classical local realism, certain statistical relationships between measurements should hold. Quantum mechanics predicted different results. When experiments were finally carried out, the results matched the predictions of quantum theory. Entangled particles behave in ways that cannot be explained by classical models of independent objects interacting locally. Zeilinger's research went further by demonstrating quantum teleportation. Quantum teleportation does not transport matter in the science fiction sense. Instead, it transfers the quantum state of one particle to another distant particle, using entanglement and classical communication. In this process, the original state is destroyed at the sending location and reconstructed at the receiving location. While this may sound extraordinary, it has been demonstrated repeatedly in laboratories around the world. These experiments reveal something profound about the nature of information in the quantum world. Information is not merely an abstract description of physical systems. It appears to play an active role in how those systems behave. Quantum information cannot be copied arbitrarily due to a rule known as the no-cloning theorem. It can be shared through entanglement in ways that defy classical expectations. And in quantum computing, information encoded in quantum states can be processed in ways that allow certain calculations to be performed far more efficiently than with classical computers. These discoveries have led many physicists to reconsider the role of information in the foundations of physics. Instead of treating information as something humans use to describe reality, some researchers now view it as a fundamental component of reality itself. From this perspective, particles and fields may represent organized patterns of information. The laws of physics then describe how that information evolves and interacts. This viewpoint has interesting implications for the study of consciousness. If the universe at its deepest level is fundamentally informational, then systems capable of processing information become especially significant. The human brain is perhaps the most sophisticated information processing structure known in nature. Within a volume of tissue roughly the size of two loosely clenched fists, billions of neurons continuously exchange signals. These signals encode sensory input, memories, emotions, and abstract thoughts. Every moment, vast networks of neurons transform incoming information from the environment into internal representations. Light striking the retina becomes electrical signals traveling through the optic nerve. Sound waves vibrating in the ear become patterns of neural activity within the auditory cortex. Touch, smell, taste, and movement are all converted into streams of information flowing through neural circuits. The brain then integrates this information into a unified model of the world. From this perspective, the brain can be understood as a highly advanced information processing system embedded within a universe where information itself may be fundamental. This does not necessarily mean that consciousness is purely informational in a simple sense, but it does suggest that understanding the organization and transformation of information may be essential for explaining how conscious experience arises. Some researchers have proposed that consciousness could correspond to particular patterns of information integration within the brain. Others suggest that certain informational structures may give rise to self-awareness when they reach sufficient complexity. Whatever the final explanation turns out to be, the connection between information and physical reality has become an increasingly important theme in modern physics. The idea that the universe may be built from informational relationships rather than purely material substances continues to inspire research across fields, ranging from quantum computing to cosmology. And within this informational universe, the human brain stands as one of the most intricate systems ever produced by cosmic evolution. A structure capable not only of processing information, but also of reflecting on the very nature of reality itself. When scientists attempt to understand systems as intricate as the brain, they often turn to a field of study known as complexity science. Complexity science examines how large systems composed of many interacting parts can produce behaviors that cannot be easily predicted by studying the parts individually. These systems are often referred to as complex adaptive systems. A complex adaptive system contains many components that interact with one another, adapt to changing conditions, and collectively generate patterns that emerge at larger scales. Examples appear throughout nature. An ant colony behaves as a coordinated community, even though each individual ant follows relatively simple rules. A flock of birds can form elaborate swirling patterns in the sky without any single bird acting as a leader. Weather systems emerge from the interactions of atmospheric currents, temperature differences, and planetary rotation. The brain fits naturally within this category. One scientist who helped pioneer the study of complexity was Murray Gell-Mann. Gell-Mann was a theoretical physicist best known for discovering quarks, the fundamental constituents of protons and neutrons. His work on particle physics earned him the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1969. Later in his career, Gell-Mann became deeply interested in the study of complex systems. He helped establish the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico, an interdisciplinary research center dedicated to understanding complexity across many fields. At the Santa Fe Institute, physicists, biologists, economists, computer scientists, and neuroscientists began collaborating to explore how large systems organize themselves. The brain soon became one of the most fascinating examples of complexity. A single neuron is an impressive biological device capable of generating electrical signals, integrating inputs, and releasing chemical messengers. But the remarkable properties of the brain do not arise from a single neuron. They emerge from the interactions of billions of them. Each neuron forms connections with thousands of others through synapses. These connections create vast networks capable of transmitting signals across different regions of the brain. At any given moment, countless signals travel through these networks simultaneously. Patterns of activity ripple through neural circuits. Groups of neurons synchronize their firing. Entire regions of the brain interact through loops of communication. From these interactions arise perception, memory, emotion, and thought. What makes complex systems particularly fascinating is the phenomenon known as emergence. Emergence occurs when simple components interacting locally give rise to behaviors that appear entirely new at larger scales. Water provides a familiar example. Individual water molecules consist of two hydrogen atoms bonded to an oxygen atom. A single molecule does not have properties such as waves, currents, or turbulence. Yet when trillions upon trillions of molecules interact in a body of water, these large-scale phenomena appear naturally. Similarly, a single neuron does not possess consciousness. But networks of neurons interacting through billions of synaptic connections may produce the patterns of activity associated with awareness. The idea that consciousness emerges from complex interactions is widely accepted in neuroscience. However, complexity science encourages researchers to look more closely at how these interactions unfold. One important concept is that complex systems often operate near what physicists call criticality. Criticality refers to a state poised between order and disorder. At this boundary, systems can display remarkable flexibility and responsiveness. Small inputs can lead to large effects, while patterns remain stable enough to maintain structure. Some neuroscientists have suggested that the brain may operate near such a critical state. Evidence for this idea comes from observations of neural activity that display properties similar to those seen in critical physical systems. For example, patterns of neuronal firing sometimes follow statistical distributions resembling avalanches. These neural avalanches involve cascades of activity spreading across networks in ways that resemble branching processes found in other complex systems. Operating near criticality may allow the brain to balance stability and adaptability. If the system were too rigid, it would struggle to respond to new information. If it were too chaotic, patterns of activity would dissolve before meaningful processing could occur. Complex adaptive systems thrive in this middle ground. Understanding the brain as a complex system also raises interesting questions about how physical processes at different scales interact. At the microscopic level, neurons rely on molecular processes involving proteins, ions, and neurotransmitters. At larger scales, networks of neurons produce electrical rhythms detectable by instruments such as electroencephalography. Even larger patterns appear in coordinated activity spanning multiple brain regions. Complex systems theory suggests that interactions across these scales can produce behaviors that cannot be predicted simply by examining one level in isolation. This raises an intriguing possibility. If the brain truly operates as a multi-level complex system, then subtle physical processes occurring at very small scales could potentially influence larger patterns of neural activity. Most neuroscientists believe that classical biochemical interactions are sufficient to explain these processes. However, some researchers have wondered whether quantum effects might occasionally influence complex biological systems in subtle ways. In complex systems, even very small perturbations can sometimes propagate through networks and influence large-scale outcomes. For example, slight variations in atmospheric conditions can grow into major weather events through nonlinear interactions. Similarly, tiny fluctuations in molecular interactions inside neurons could, in principle, influence neural signaling if those fluctuations become amplified through network dynamics. Whether quantum processes play any role in such interactions remains an open question. For now, there is no clear experimental evidence demonstrating that quantum effects significantly influence large-scale brain behavior. Nevertheless, complexity science reminds us that biological systems often produce unexpected behaviors when many components interact simultaneously. The brain represents one of the most intricate complex systems known in nature. Within a network of billions of neurons exchanging signals every millisecond, patterns emerge that allow organisms to perceive the world, learn from experience, and reflect on their own existence. From the perspective of complexity science, consciousness may be understood not as a property of individual components, but as a dynamic pattern, arising from the collective interactions of the entire system. And if the brain truly operates as a complex adaptive system, embedded within the laws of physics, then understanding consciousness may require insights from multiple disciplines at once. Neuroscience reveals the biological structures. Physics explores the fundamental rules governing matter and energy. Complexity science studies how simple interactions give rise to organized patterns. Together, these fields form part of an ongoing effort to understand how a network of living cells can produce the remarkable phenomenon we call the mind. One of the greatest challenges in studying the brain is not simply understanding its complexity. It is also the difficulty of observing what is happening at the smallest scales, where many of the most intriguing ideas originate. Neuroscience has developed remarkable tools for measuring brain activity. Electroencephalography can detect electrical patterns across the scalp. Functional magnetic resonance imaging reveals changes in blood flow associated with neural activity. Tiny electrodes can even record the firing of individual neurons, yet these techniques mostly operate at relatively large scales compared with the microscopic structures inside cells. When scientists begin asking questions about molecules, proteins, or potential quantum processes within neurons, the measurement problem becomes much more difficult. Inside a living neuron, thousands of different molecular processes are unfolding at once. Proteins change shape. Ion channels open and close. Neurotransmitter molecules diffuse across membranes. Microtubules assemble and disassemble as the cytoskeleton reorganizes itself. All of this activity takes place within spaces measured in nanometers. A nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. For comparison, a single human hair is roughly 80,000 to 100,000 nanometers wide. Trying to observe molecular activity inside neurons therefore requires extraordinary precision. Traditional microscopes rely on visible light, whose wavelength is typically between 400 and 700 nanometers. This imposes a fundamental limit on resolution known as the diffraction limit. Because of this limit, ordinary optical microscopes cannot clearly resolve structures smaller than roughly 200 nanometers. Many important cellular components, including protein complexes and molecular assemblies, are smaller than this threshold. To overcome these limitations, scientists have developed new imaging techniques such as super-resolution microscopy. Methods like stimulated emission depletion microscopy and photoactivated localization microscopy can achieve resolutions down to tens of nanometers. These tools allow researchers to visualize molecular structures within living cells with unprecedented detail. Even with these advances, measuring dynamic processes inside neurons remains extremely challenging. Molecules move rapidly. Chemical reactions occur in microseconds or less. Electrical fields fluctuate constantly. If quantum processes were occurring inside structures such as microtubules, detecting them would require instruments capable of measuring extremely subtle physical signals. One promising direction involves the use of quantum sensors. Quantum sensors exploit the sensitivity of quantum systems to detect tiny changes in physical quantities such as magnetic fields, electric fields, or temperature. Among the most advanced examples are sensors based on nitrogen vacancy centers in diamond. A nitrogen vacancy center forms when a carbon atom in a diamond crystal is replaced by a nitrogen atom and a neighboring carbon atom is missing. This tiny defect creates a localized quantum system that interacts with magnetic fields. By illuminating the diamond with laser light and measuring the resulting fluorescence, researchers can detect extremely small magnetic signals produced by nearby molecules. Nitrogen vacancy magnetometry has become a powerful tool for measuring magnetic fields at the nanoscale. In principle, such sensors could be used to detect the magnetic signals generated by neuronal activity at extremely small distances. Researchers are exploring whether these sensors might eventually allow scientists to observe molecular-level processes occurring within neurons. Another approach involves techniques derived from quantum optics and ultrafast spectroscopy. Ultrafast spectroscopy uses laser pulses lasting only femtoseconds to study how energy moves through molecular systems. These techniques have already been used to investigate quantum coherence in photosynthetic complexes. Applying similar tools to neural tissue could potentially reveal subtle physical interactions occurring within cellular structures. Several research institutions are actively developing technologies aimed at probing the brain with greater precision. The Center for Brain Science at Harvard University is one example of an interdisciplinary program bringing together neuroscientists, physicists, engineers, and chemists to develop new methods for studying neural systems. Researchers there and at other institutions are exploring advanced imaging techniques, nanoscale sensors, and novel experimental approaches designed to reveal the fine details of brain activity. Despite these efforts, confirming the presence of quantum processes in the brain remains extremely difficult. One challenge is that many biological signals are weak compared with the background noise present in living tissue. Thermal motion constantly jostles molecules. Water molecules collide with proteins billions of times per second. Electrical activity from neighboring neurons generates fluctuating fields. All of these factors can obscure the subtle signatures that quantum phenomena might produce. Another complication arises from the nature of quantum measurements themselves. In quantum mechanics, observing a system often alters the system being observed. Measuring delicate quantum states can cause them to collapse or decohere. This means that even if quantum processes were occurring inside neurons, detecting them might disrupt the very phenomena researchers hope to study. For this reason, experimental tests of quantum brain theories require extremely careful design. Scientists must distinguish genuine quantum effects from classical biological signals, while minimizing disturbances to the system. At present, no definitive experimental evidence has confirmed that quantum processes play a significant role in neural function. Most observations of brain activity remain fully consistent with classical electrochemical mechanisms. Nevertheless, technological progress continues to expand what scientists can measure. Only a few decades ago, imaging individual neurons in a living brain seemed almost impossible. Today, researchers can observe networks of neurons firing in real time. Similarly, advances in quantum sensing and nanoscale measurement may eventually allow scientists to probe the brain at levels that are currently beyond reach. Scientific understanding often advances in step with improvements in instrumentation. When Galileo turned one of the earliest telescopes toward the sky, he revealed moons orbiting Jupiter and mountains on the surface of the moon. Those discoveries reshaped humanity's view of the cosmos. In much the same way, new measurement technologies may eventually reveal previously hidden layers of activity within the brain. Whether those layers involve quantum processes, subtle molecular interactions, or entirely new mechanisms remains to be seen. For now, the limits of measurement remind us that some questions remain open not because they lack answers, but because we have not yet built the tools needed to see them clearly. After exploring a wide range of ideas connecting quantum physics and the brain, it is helpful to pause and consider what the majority of scientists currently think. Across modern neuroscience, the prevailing view remains grounded in the classical model of brain function. In this model, the brain operates through electrochemical processes occurring within networks of neurons. Electrical impulses called action potentials travel along axons. Chemical neurotransmitters carry signals across synapses. Ion channels regulate the flow of charged particles across cell membranes. These mechanisms have been studied for decades through experiments in electrophysiology, neurochemistry, and molecular biology. Researchers can record the electrical activity of individual neurons. They can observe how neurotransmitters influence signaling between cells. They can track how learning changes the strength of synaptic connections through processes such as long-term potentiation and long-term depression. Long-term potentiation, first studied extensively by neuroscientists such as Timothy Bliss and Terry Lomo in the 1970s, refers to the strengthening of synapses following repeated stimulation. This process is widely considered one of the biological mechanisms underlying learning and memory. Experiments have repeatedly demonstrated how synaptic plasticity alters neural circuits over time. Similarly, advances in brain imaging have allowed scientists to observe how large-scale networks coordinate activity across different regions of the brain. Functional magnetic resonance imaging reveals patterns of blood flow associated with cognitive tasks. Electroencephalography detects rhythmic electrical activity such as alpha waves, beta waves, and gamma oscillations. Together, these observations provide strong evidence that classical biological processes explain a large portion of brain function. For this reason, most neuroscientists do not currently believe that quantum mechanics plays a central role in neural computational consciousness. Quantum brain theories remain minority hypotheses. This does not mean that such ideas are dismissed outright. Science rarely rejects possibilities simply because they seem unusual. Instead, scientific acceptance depends on evidence. The central principle guiding scientific progress is empirical verification. Hypotheses must be tested through observation and experiment. Results must be reproducible by independent research groups using reliable methods. When a new theory proposes mechanisms that differ from established explanations, it must demonstrate clear experimental support. At present, no widely accepted experiments have confirmed that quantum coherence, quantum state collapse, or other quantum phenomena directly influence cognitive processes in the brain. Most of the evidence gathered so far supports the classical picture of neural activity. This situation does not necessarily mean that quantum effects play no role whatsoever. After all, the molecules and atoms that make up neurons ultimately obey the laws of quantum mechanics. Every chemical bond, every electron movement, and every molecular interaction is governed by quantum physics at the fundamental level. However, the question under debate is whether large-scale brain functions rely on uniquely quantum phenomena, such as long-lived superpositions or entanglement. For now, the available evidence suggests that these delicate quantum states are unlikely to persist long enough inside the warm biological environment of the brain to influence neural computation. The calculations performed by researchers such as Max Tegmark indicate that quantum coherence would likely disappear extremely quickly under typical biological conditions. That conclusion does not close the discussion entirely, but it does set a high bar for any theory proposing quantum brain processes. Scientific skepticism plays an important role here. Skepticism is not the same as dismissal or hostility toward new ideas. Instead, it is a method for ensuring that explanations are supported by solid evidence rather than speculation. Many scientific breakthroughs initially face skepticism. When Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift in the early 20th century, most geologists rejected the idea because a clear physical mechanism had not yet been identified. Decades later, evidence from plate tectonics confirmed that continents do indeed move across Earth's surface. Similarly, the existence of atoms was debated for centuries before experimental evidence finally resolved the question. Skepticism encourages scientists to refine their hypotheses, gather better data, and design more precise experiments. In this sense, critical evaluation is an essential part of the scientific process. Quantum theories of consciousness continue to generate interest partly because they attempt to address a mystery that remains unsolved. Despite remarkable progress in neuroscience, The relationship between neural activity and subjective experience is still not fully understood. The brain clearly produces consciousness, yet explaining how physical processes give rise to the feeling of awareness remains one of the deepest questions in science. Some researchers believe that classical neuroscience will eventually provide the answer as experimental tools continue to improve. Others remain open to the possibility that new principles of physics or new theoretical frameworks might be needed. At the moment, the discussion remains an active area of investigation rather than a settled conclusion. Scientists continue to test ideas, develop new measurement techniques, and explore theoretical models that might explain the nature of consciousness. As with many scientific mysteries, the final answer may emerge gradually through a combination of careful experimentation and creative thinking, and whether quantum physics ultimately proves central to this story or not, the exploration itself continues to reveal new insights about both the brain and the universe in which it evolved. Across the vast history of the universe, one development stands out as particularly remarkable: matter learned to think. This statement may sound poetic, yet it reflects a genuine scientific observation. The atoms that make up the human brain were forged in ancient stars billions of years ago. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus were created through nuclear fusion inside stellar interiors and scattered across space by exploding supernovae. Those atoms eventually became part of planets, oceans, and living organisms. Over immense stretches of time, evolution organized those atoms into increasingly complex structures. Cells formed, multicellular organisms appeared, nervous systems developed to coordinate behavior and respond to the environment. Eventually, in a small group of primates living on one planet orbiting one star among hundreds of billions in the Milky Way galaxy, neural systems became complex enough to support awareness. Within the human brain, roughly 86 billion neurons exchange electrical signals. Each neuron forms connections with thousands of others through synapses. These connections create networks containing hundreds of trillions of pathways through which information flows. From the activity of these networks emerges the phenomenon we call consciousness. Thoughts arise, memories are recalled, plans are made, questions are asked. Among those questions is one that has occupied scientists and philosophers for centuries. How can physical matter produce conscious experience? We know a great deal about the mechanisms involved in brain activity. Neuroscience has revealed how neurons communicate through electrical impulses and chemical signals. Researchers can map networks, measure brain rhythms, and observe how learning reshapes synaptic connections. Yet the deeper relationship between physical processes and subjective experience remains mysterious. Why does neural activity feel like something from the inside? Why does the brain generate an inner world of color, sound, emotion, and meaning? This question lies at the heart of the exploration we have been following. Some scientists believe that classical biological processes will eventually provide a complete explanation. In this view, consciousness emerges from the immense complexity of neural networks operating according to known physical laws. Others have proposed that deeper physical principles might be involved. Quantum theories of consciousness represent one attempt to explore that possibility. The central question is whether the strange phenomena observed in quantum mechanics could influence processes inside the brain. Quantum systems behave in ways that defy everyday intuition. Particles can exist in superpositions, occupying multiple states simultaneously. Entangled systems display correlations that persist across distance. Measurement appears to play a fundamental role in determining outcomes. These features have led some researchers to wonder whether quantum events might contribute to conscious experience. The proposals vary widely. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff suggested that quantum processes within microtubulars might generate discrete moments of awareness. Other researchers have explored quantum field models, holographic information patterns, or mathematical frameworks inspired by quantum probability. Meanwhile, critics have pointed out that the warm, noisy environment of the brain may prevent delicate quantum states from persisting long enough to influence neural activity. Physicists such as Max Tegmark have calculated that quantum coherence within neural structures would likely collapse extremely rapidly due to interactions with surrounding molecules. At present, no experimental evidence has conclusively demonstrated that quantum processes play a functional role in the brain. Most neuroscientists continue to view consciousness as an emergent property of classical neural networks, yet the discussion remains open. Science often advances through the exploration of possibilities. Ideas are proposed, tested, refined, and sometimes replaced by new theories as evidence accumulates. The investigation of consciousness sits at the intersection of several scientific disciplines. Neuroscience studies the structure and function of the brain. Physics explores the fundamental laws governing matter and energy. Philosophy examines the conceptual questions surrounding experience and knowledge. Complexity science investigates how interactions among many components produce organized patterns. Together, these fields form a collaborative effort to understand one of the most extraordinary phenomena in the universe. A small collection of atoms arranged in a particular way becomes capable of reflection, capable of curiosity, capable of wondering about its own origins. When we step back and consider the broader context, the story becomes even more striking. The universe began roughly 13.8 billion years ago, with a rapid expansion from a hot, dense state. Over billions of years, stars formed, galaxies assembled, and planets emerged. On at least one of those planets, chemistry evolved into biology evolved into cognition, and cognition evolved into the capacity for self-awareness. In a sense, the universe has developed the ability to observe itself. Whether consciousness ultimately arises solely from classical neural processes, or whether deeper physical principles are involved, remains uncertain. But the search itself reflects one of the most distinctive qualities of the human mind: curiosity, the desire to understand how the world works. Every scientific instrument, every theoretical model, every experiment designed to probe the brain represents part of that ongoing quest. Perhaps future discoveries will reveal new connections between physics and consciousness. New measurement technologies may uncover previously hidden layers of activity inside neurons. Advances in neuroscience may illuminate the mechanisms by which networks of cells generate awareness, or the explanation may emerge gradually as scientists integrate knowledge from many different fields. For now, the mystery remains, and there is something quietly beautiful about that. The atoms inside your brain were once scattered through interstellar clouds. Today they form structures capable of imagining distant galaxies, contemplating quantum theory, and asking questions about the nature of reality. The universe has produced a system that can reflect on its own existence. A thinking universe, contemplating itself through the quiet activity of billions of neurons. And somewhere within that activity, the experience of awareness continues to unfold.